Rats. A rodent that resembles a large mouse, typically having a pointed snout and a long, sparsely haired tail. Some kinds have become cosmopolitan and are sometimes responsible for transmitting diseases. We've seen them before. Rat kings, gay rat weddings, rat boys, etc.
Rat boy, I resent that.
They are vermin that require little to no attention on our part, unless, perhaps, they can aid in furthering our scientific knowledge. In 1968, groups of mice and rats were gathered from the wild and deposited into holding pens in a laboratory outside of Poolesville, Maryland. This habitat featured everything native to the rodents from their time on the outside, including nesting places, food storage, and access to water. Seemingly, nothing had changed about their situation, but they were under the close observation of John B. Calhoun, a scientist who was world-renowned for his experiments regarding overpopulation. Drawing a parallel between human and rodent behavior, Calhoun theorized the hastened growth, plateau, downfall, and extinction of these rodent colonies was an omen to human overpopulation concerns. Calhoun found the populations of these rodents grew from the initial control group to a capped number given the size of the habitat. After less than a year, Calhoun observed a breakdown in the social structure of the rodents, noting them vacating their young before fully weaning, homosexual behavior, and wounding young by dominant males as a territorial measure. At day 600 in captivity, females ceased to reproduce, and males began solitary pursuits, only eating, drinking, grooming, and sleeping by themselves. Calhoun had, in his mind, created the perfect metaphor for humankind, where, when all social roles are seemingly filled, all space is occupied, a breakdown in complex social behavior begins, which would ultimately lead to the extinction of humans as we know them.
Like that's ever gonna happen.
This is where Mrs. Frisbee and the Rats of NIMH comes in. Written by Robert C. O'Brien, Mrs. Frisbee is the story of the titular Mrs. Frisbee, a widowed field mouse doing everything she can to protect her ill son Timothy from dying due to pneumonia. This includes visiting the strange rats who live under a rosebush, who appear young, strong, and very, very odd. As the story goes, Mrs. Frisbee finds her youngest son Timothy sick one morning and travels to see Mr. Ages, the local mouse doctor, who diagnoses him with pneumonia. Mr. Ages lays out the stakes of the story quite bluntly. If he gets the least bit cold or breathes cold air, even a breath or two, the pneumonia will surely be worse, and he may not recover. At the onset of this life-or-death situation, Mrs. Frisbee heads home and saves a young crow named Jeremy from his entanglement with a shiny string. He is grateful and says he owes her a life debt sometime in the future. Back at home, Timothy drinks the medicine and is heading in the right direction. Due to abnormally warm weather, the farmer who owns the land the Frisbees are occupying decides to till the field to begin spring planting. Timothy is not ready to be moved, but in all good luck, the farmer's tractor malfunctions and puts off planting for at least another week. Now desperate, Mrs. Frisbee learns from Jeremy that an old, wise owl deep in the forest can offer guidance to animals in need of help. Paying her back, Jeremy flies to the owl's nest, where the owl informs Mrs. Frisbee that the rats living under the rose bush by the farmer's house can help her. This is only after she casually mentions her husband's name, Jonathan. His name is not unknown in these woods, the owl tells her, and if you are his widow, that puts matters in a different light. Confused, Mrs. Frisbee decides to visit the rats because the least they could do is turn her away. While venturing into their nest, she meets Mr. Ages, also presumably coming for a visit. Mr. Ages is defensive at first until he learns she met with the owl.
No one has ever seen the owl and lived to tell about it.
I'm a boss-ass bitch.
Impressed by her bravery, he ushers her further into the nest. She meets Justin, one of the leaders of the rats, and Isabella, a young rat just learning to read and write. Mrs. Frisbee is fascinated by the advancements the rats have created for themselves underground, including massive storage facilities, libraries, laboratories, all electrified by cables stolen from the farmer. The rats are ashamed of this behavior, but recognize it as a necessary evil until they're able to sustain themselves. Nicodemus, the leader of the rats, tells her, "We discovered early that in order to stop stealing, we would, for a while, have to steal more than ever." Nicodemus tells her the story of the rats, and how they came to live under the rose bush. Years ago, the rats were ordinary vermin relying on waste from humans before they were captured by the National Institute of Mental Health, known as NIMH. At NIMH, they're experimented on by Dr. Schultz, who was working with 2 graduate students, testing their intellect and injecting them with a special serum meant to expand their capability to retain information. The injections work too well, and the rats are able to escape their enclosure and the laboratory, taking with them mice who had experienced similar testing. Among the mice were Mrs. Frisbee's husband Jonathan and Mr. Ages. Nicodemus also explains a schism created by his greatest friend Jenner, who believed stealing wasn't wrong. Jennifer had recently left the colony with a few of his loyal followers. Mrs. Frisbee learns that, in order to further their knowledge, the rats drugged the farmer's cat Dragon, and Jonathan had been appointed the task of dropping the sleeping agent into Dragon's food. A mistake was made, though, and Jonathan was killed by Dragon.
He was killed today while drugging the farmer's cat, Dragon. I never knew just what happened.
Mrs. Frisbee explains her situation to Nicodemus, who in turn explains the rats can build a mechanism that will move her cinder block home to the lee of the giant stone in the middle of the farmer's field. There, it will be protected from the plow. She volunteers to put the drug into Dragon's food, but is caught by the farmer's son when trying to do so. While the rats set up the mechanism, Mrs. Frisbee overhears a conversation about 7 dead rats discovered at an auto shop, where it seems they were attempting to move a motor. The charred remains were examined by a scientist known as Dr. Schultz, who took a keen interest in other rodents in the area. Fearing the worst, she escapes and informs the rats of their impending discovery, and they develop a plan to move house to Thorn Valley, their scouted location for a rat civilization. They successfully move the Frisbee home and fool the doctor into believing nothing but ordinary rats occupied the space under the rose bush, at least for now. The novel ends with Mrs. Frisbee telling her children about her wonderful adventures and stating they may visit the rats someday. Mrs. Frisbee and the Rats of NIMH won the Newbery Medal honor for Outstanding Children's Fiction, and this is pretty well deserved. O'Brien writes with a bluntness that never hits you over the head, but can be surprisingly effective given the subject matter. There is mention of death around every corner, as the lives of these small creatures are treated with great seriousness. Upon rereading the novel, I found myself drawn into the direct way O'Brien draws you into Mrs. Frisbee's struggles, how her resilience to save her son leads her to pluck up her courage and speak with many different species. She's an extremely motivated character thrust into extremely extraordinary circumstances, so a reader wants to see her succeed. Being a novel for children, there's not anything grisly or disgusting, but there are several dark implications of violence or other morbidities. For example, Mrs. Frisbee notices the bones of several small creatures in the owl's nest when she visits him. On the rat's journey to discover a place to learn, they discover the dead body of a toy tinker. The rats also ponder their now obvious differences between themselves and regular rats. Nicodemus says, "Occasionally we came upon other rats, and a few times we talked with them, but not for long, because after a few words they would begin to look at us strangely and edge away. Either the diet or the injections at NIMH had made us bigger and stronger than other rats, and all the rats we saw looked, to us, surprisingly weak and puny, so we were set apart from even our own kind." We'll come back to this. There isn't really a mystery at the heart of Mrs. Frisbee, but the reveal of information creates lore that builds a foundation for future stories. What happened to Jenner? What is the rat's new home like? Are more rats inclined to want to live a convenient lifestyle? Is the nature of information retention inherent to creatures who aren't genetically modified? These concepts would be explored in the sequels to O'Brien's book, written by his daughter. Raxo and the Rats of NIMH followed in 1986 and continues the story of Mrs. Frisbee's son, Timothy, despite what the title will tell you, as well as the rats after their permanent move to Thorn Valley. Set 3 years after the events of the first book, Timothy is traveling to Thorn Valley for another term at the rats' school, but is unable to fly there with Jeremy due to Jeremy's obligations to his ill mother. Timothy instead intends to travel by foot and is found by a young rat named Raxo, who is oddly inquisitive when it comes to Timothy's reason for travel. Timothy explains he's on his way to Thorn Valley to learn from the rats, and Raxo takes a particular interest in this. He knows the idea of learning to read or write, but hasn't yet done so. Timmy is suspicious, but invites Raxo along, figuring he might have heard this from an animal in the forest. Raxo proves his incompetence on the journey by being loud, obnoxious, and careless of his whereabouts. They began to walk again. Raxo walked more and more slowly. He was panting hard. Timothy tried walking a little ahead of him at a steady pace, but the rat fell farther and farther behind. Finally, he stopped. "I'm sorry," he said, "but I have to take a nap. Perhaps we could just sit down and rest a minute," Timothy said. "Sure," said the rat, but no sooner had they sat beside the path than Raxo tumbled over onto the dry leaves and fell asleep. While traveling at night, Timothy is attacked by an animal and cared for by Raxo, who realizes he has to be the responsible one in the situation if they want to survive. They make it to Thorn Valley, and Raxo expects a big congratulations for his efforts, but his deeds are dwarfed by the rat's affection for Timmy. Raxo is jealous, and he takes this out on a fellow student, Christopher. Raxo also meets Isabella, who, after 3 years, is simping really hard for Justin. There's a long stretch of the novel where Raxo tries and fails to impress the other students and teachers with his knowledge of concepts of the big city, but no one is interested in those kinds of conveniences. They're focused on their work and how to improve the colony. Raxo also struggles with a secret of his own. His father is Jenner. He admits this to Nicodemus, who doesn't encourage him to keep this a secret, but to reveal it in his own time. After a visit from a scouting Jeremy, he reports that there are humans on the north side of Thorn Valley, seemingly constructing a dam. A group goes out to investigate, and sure enough, a dam that will flood the entire valley and the surrounding farms is being erected. The rats go into crisis mode and attempt to learn all they can about the dam and its socio-economic ramifications. They hear from Mrs. Frisbee that local farmers are actively fighting the dam so they don't lose their land, but this is not enough. In order to prevent local destruction, Justin decides they need to sabotage the dam from the inside. Raxo is eager to be chosen for this dangerous mission and proves himself tremendously on the practice scenarios Justin creates to test the rats' level-headedness. Raxo and Timothy are chosen to participate, but Isabella is not, and she screams at Justin. In a moment of levity, some of the rats find a reporter with a farmer poking around in the valley. A small wicker basket made by the rats is discovered by the reporter, but Raxo is able to retrieve it. Christopher gets hurt in the process of escaping. At the dam, the party is tasked with learning the computer program designed to make the dam function. They are to create a program that is identical to the human one, but designed without safety limits to purposely cause damage to the dam and demonstrate its uselessness. They all work hard, but do not notice when 2 security guards catch them using a Xerox machine. Raxo writes a small note asking them to stop trying to capture the rats, and the security guards take the note and decide to report their discovery of intelligent rats to the local news. The rats, worried, ultimately decide no one will believe their story and that the guards were drunk instead. The day of the dam's opening comes and the program is nowhere near ready. Hours until daylight, a power failure occurs, but no one in the party is able to determine who might have caused it. They find a note stating that someone's son is there and he cannot swim. Raxo determines the saboteur was Jenner and took matters into his own hands to ensure Raxo's safety. He is touched, but distressed that his father has now died due to electrocution. The dam fails, the reports of intelligent rats are dismissed, and the colony is able to live in the valley without fear of human interaction. For now. Raxo and the Rats of NIMH is sort of a downgrade from its predecessor. The prose is less sophisticated, and Conley spells out everything the characters are thinking or feeling without showing a reader these things through their actions. Raxo has a grand notion of wanting to be a hero, and does mature a lot through the story, but his own shortcomings hold him back. He is jealous, lazy, impulsive, and egotistic, and is rightfully reprimanded for these characteristics. He does show more selfless traits as the story progresses, such as retrieving the basket and figuring out the Xerox machine, but he's not as sympathetic as Mrs. Frisbee. The Rats' civilization has expanded by this novel, and they have implemented an entire infrastructure of education, subsistence farming, and security, an impressive feat in just 3 years. They can survive on only what they need and reject most of Raxo's modern excesses, such as candy. Death and destruction are still present in the story, but not as sharply implemented as before. Conley leans into the fantastical tone of children's literature more than her father, so while there are still life and death stakes, they are not as blunt or realistic, for lack of a better word. Conley does show us the rats' willingness to subside on their own land and resources instead of stealing what they haven't created themselves. They are always willing to help creatures in need and keep themselves in check when they lose sight of their goals. However, they're realistic when it comes to living outside their means, or not being able to provide for creatures that might take their lifestyle for granted or want to harm them. Conley looks further into this with the final installment of the trilogy, R.T., Margaret, and the Rats of NIMH. Set months after Raxo, RT, Margaret, and the Rats of NIMH follows two human children, Artie and Margaret, who are separated from their family while out on a camping trip. Artie is a nonverbal child, and Margaret is considered overweight by her mother and bossy by kids in school. Margaret is ostracized by her fellow classmates due to Artie's temperament and often feels frustrated that he gets attention from their mother while she is blamed for knowing better. Margaret at first finds Artie a burden to be stuck in the woods with, but still feels a responsibility to keep him safe. Meanwhile, Christopher, a young rat introduced in Raxo, is informed that human children have been discovered in the valley and vows to discover them. Along with Raxo and Isabella, Christopher finds them and gives Artie a small bit of food. Before he can escape, Margaret traps him and holds him hostage, having overheard him say something to Artie about the larger colony. Hoping they can receive help, Margaret bargains with Nicodemus. The two are allowed to stay with the colony as long as they do their fair share of labor. Margaret clears away a hawk's nest to keep the predator at bay, and Artie is mostly left to be mentored by Christopher. Christopher shows him a secret place where they hide small trinkets for one another. While Margaret matures exponentially with all their newfound independence, Artie too is finding his voice, but is accident-prone. The rats, especially Justin, believe the children to be more trouble than they're worth. One day, news comes that Margaret and Artie are presumed dead, and Nicodemus decides it's time for them to make a reappearance. He decides to go with them too, as he finds himself too old to continue leading the rats. Nicodemus coaches Margaret on what she needs to say if anyone asks their whereabouts. Margaret finds this helpful but difficult, but is able to evade any pressure when her friends and family are relieved to see her again. An obvious change is present in the kids, as Artie is now more assertive and Margaret is more strung out and contemplative. A reporter, the same one who visited the valley in the previous novel, interviews the kids, and the identity of their saviors are almost revealed. Artie sees a rat crawling along an alleyway and accidentally calls that after Christopher. The reporter starts putting two and two together and requests another interview with Margaret, who caves and tells her everything. To prove herself, a helicopter is chartered, and their family, as well as the reporter, fly to Thorn Valley. The locations are familiar, but there are shockingly no longer traces of the rats. Thorn Valley has been scrubbed clean of any evidence the rats ever resided there. Suspicious, Artie goes to he and Christopher's secret spot and discovers an arrow made of stones, presumably pointing towards the direction of the rats' new colony. Artie smiles. The rats do not play a huge role in this story, but their role is important for two reasons. 1. In taking the children under their wing to not starve to death, their colony demonstrates an understanding and implementation of goodwill and selflessness. 2. They are an ideal for anyone to strive for, living out in the woods, off the grid, and subsiding entirely on what they are able to make on their own. They teach Artie and Margaret how to analyze dangers, consider others, and how to be brave. This doesn't mean the kids aren't scared, but bravery is what you do despite of being scared. The rats are a catalyst for betterment in this story and actively oppose Calhoun's conclusion in his experiments. Throughout these books, O'Brien and Connolly demonstrate an almost eager giddiness to show up Calhoun, where Calhoun concludes the rats mirror humanity and that they will limp away from expansion and cease building a thriving community. The authors conclude the rats are only in danger from outside forces, from the actual scientists wanting to drive home this conclusion. They are able to evade recapture from Dr. Schultz because they have essentially bonded their newfound awareness with their animalistic instinct to survive. Yet, they haven't shied away from their willingness to help creatures in need, even the kind that originally captured them. They are aware of the differences between them and their own kind, but they do not view it entirely as a hindrance. It's now a tool to help the rats further their own society, to actively circumvent the treatment they've received. The doom of societal collapse is not present in these stories, and there's a hopeful glow of breaking the long-fated cycle of begatting fear. Perhaps we shouldn't pay attention to rats, as many characters in this story do. They are vermin, classically misunderstood. But O'Brien and Connolly dare you to look at the world from their point of view of the little guy, of a life so easily ignored that only those with pursuits of knowledge enhancement would even think to interact with it. The Rats of NIMH are a cautionary tale of mankind's hubris, and what creatures do to one another to understand or pervert nature. But how one reacts to that treatment is the true exploration of these novels, and the authors give the reader reinforcement of being kind, yet firm, in the face of this kind of adversity. Look out for the little guys, and they'll look out for you.
Bart, I told you before, stop gnawing on the drywall.